Billy Trenter's grandma sometimes said that life was most often weighted in your favor, but he'd never taken too much notice of her words. Most of what his grandma said didn't make much sense to him, and he didn't like to waste his time in trying to figure it out. As far as he saw it, sometimes old people just liked to flap their gums to show the world they were still alive. He picked his way over the saw-edged rocks, treading carefully across the hazardous, slippery terrain. The tide was on the turn and the sea would soon start seeping back in again, but he had plenty of time before the water got all the way back up the shore. Humor her. That's what his father said in a low voice whenever Billy started getting confused over his grandma's funny little sayings. She's been around for a long time and she knows more than you and I could ever guess at. Or she thinks she does. The problem was, Billy was just as confused by his father's explanation as he was by his grandmother's old-fashioned talk. In his opinion, Grandma Eileen didn't know squat. Half the time she forgot to put the tube back on the toothpaste in the bathroom the family shared, and, more often than not, he was the one who got the blame for it. His grandma allowed him to take that blame too. He'd seen the smug smirk on her face whenever his mother hauled him out yet again for his thoughtlessness and selfishness. Maybe that was what she meant when she said life was weighted in your favor? Or rather, she meant that his life was weighted in her favor. He was her fall guy and there wasn't a lot he could do about that. He veered around a long, flat snake of seaweed that was already starting to dry out in the heat of the sun. It was baking hot today, but he liked days like this. Especially if he got to come down to Larson'S Cove. His plan was to walk down to the wharf and past Larson'S shed to hang his fishing pole over the end of the pier. He hoped to catch some fish as they came back on the tide, maybe some little, or not so little, yellowfin croaker. He had thought of asking his friend Aiden to come with him today, but then he'd remembered that Aiden and his family had gone to the city to do a once-a-month shop in the big box stores there. There weren't any big box stores in Meadowville. Heck, they didn't even have a Kmart or a Taco Bell. There was a McDonald's and a Wendy's though, and there was talk of getting an Applebee's, but the talk had been bouncing around for at least a year now without anything happening to suggest that it might be true. No, Meadowville had to make do with its little homegrown stores and restaurants, the types of places that no one living outside the town had ever heard of. Larson's shed was once one of those restaurants. It was a sprawling building that jutted out halfway along the wharf that he was headed for now. Larson's shed was a seafood restaurant with weather-ravaged signs on the outside that boasted proudly of freshly caught crabs and chilled house wine by the glass. Billy had gone there a few times with his family before the old owners upped and left, although the family usually went to Pop's Diner on Main Street for their celebration dinners. They also went to Pop's every now and again on Friday nights, those evenings when his mother said she'd had enough and was done with cooking. Mandy Trenter was generally fairly even-tempered and obliging, but sometimes the burden of cooking every night for her family started to wear her down. Not that Billy minded. He would happily eat dinner at Pop's every Friday night of the month if that was an option on offer. The smell of salt and the icky stench of dried seaweed was intense down here. Billy wrinkled his nose as he switched his fishing pole to the other hand, balancing himself before making a long stride between two big rocks. The little scuttling crabs that like to hide themselves in the crevices and peer out with mobile, beady eyes shifted and moved as he passed, swiftly darting back into the safety of the shadows. He thought again about how much he liked days like this. Mostly, Meadowville was a nice place to live. The town was crammed between endless miles of the rolling meadows that it had taken its name from and the even more endless Pacific Ocean. Billy sometimes wondered why the town's founding fathers hadn't named it Oceanville instead, but he wasn't going to get himself all bent out of shape by trying to work out why. He supposed he could always ask his grandma, but he just wasn't all that interested in the answer. He crouched down to peer into an oily-looking rock pool, on the lookout for some sea snails or limpets that he could use as bait. No one else knew where he was spending his time this afternoon, but that wasn't anything unusual. Meadowville was a sleepy, safe place, the type of place where kids played out on the streets until after dark. No one blinked an eye if a kid decided he wanted to go off on his own for a few hours on a sunny Saturday afternoon. A seabird reeled overhead, cawing harshly as it circled around once more and then headed out to sea. He found an injured bird down here 2 weeks ago, broken but still alive. One of its wings was held out wide, as if it was unable to retract it back and lay it flat against its body. The gull had pecked viciously at his hand when he tried to help it and he had been forced to retreat to a safe distance to watch. They had stared quietly at each other for a long time, boy and bird, and he thought they had almost reached the point where they understood each other. However, someone had come down to the beach then and they'd brought an unleashed dog with them. The bird had squawked and flap-hopped away, managing to get back down to the water before the dog got to it. It had floated on the tide for a while, staring belligerently at the barking dog while flapping its useless wing and unsuccessfully trying to launch itself into the air. Billy had eventually grown bored and left, and the dog had found something smelly and rotten amongst the rocks to grab its attention. He'd never seen the bird again, never found out whether it had lived or died. He'd told his grandma about it and she said it had probably been eaten by a shark or got waterlogged and drowned. He stood up and a small pebble dislodged by his foot plopped into the pool. He wasn't having much luck in finding bait today. All the rock pools were filled with the same oily, murky water as the first one he'd looked at. Perhaps he could use a rock to knock off some of the mussels that grew in bunches on the exposed wooden posts beneath the wharf. He was close to the wharf now, nearly close enough to touch the long shadows that the structure threw in striped bands across the rocks. He glanced at the rock pool again. That dirty water was strange though. The water in the pools was usually clear, about as clear as a pane of glass. He went to take another step but instead stopped right where he was, squinting hard in the fierce glare of sunlight that bounced off the wet rocks and tried to blind him. There was something going on over at Larson's shed, and whatever it was, he had the strangest feeling that he wasn't supposed to have seen it. Mandy Trenter plunked herself down in the old rocking chair on the porch. She was holding a bowl of peas in pods that she planned to shell in her lap, along with a spare one for the freshly shelled peas. She dropped an empty plastic pail down on the sun-bleached wooden boards for the empty husks and picked up the first pea pod. She expertly slid her nail down the seam and looked across at her mother, who was dozing open-mouthed on the other rocking chair, the one with a broken rocker that no longer rocked. For some reason, Eileen seemed to prefer that seat, but she always had been contrary. "It's getting hotter." Eileen blinked and peered blearily at her through the dirty lenses of her reading glasses. The magazine on her lap slid sideways and fell to the ground. "What's that you say?" "I said it's a scorcher." "How can you see through those glasses?" "Give them a wipe on your apron." "It's a wonder you can work out if you're coming or going." "Maybe I like it that way." "And maybe you're just stubborn." "Stubborn as a mule." "Takes one to know one," Eileen said pertly. Mandy flicked the 4 perfectly round peas into the bottom of the bowl and dropped the empty shell into the pail. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her mother take off her spectacles and clean them on the faded floral apron she wore tied around her waist. She was mildly surprised that she had taken any notice of her suggestion. Sometimes it was best to keep your thoughts to yourself where Eileen was concerned. The old lady had been living with them for almost 5 years now, ever since her second husband Perry died. Mandy and Nathan hadn't wanted Eileen to come into their home with her ornery moods and her loud opinions, cautious of how much her presence would change their peaceful family existence. And it was a peaceful existence. Billy, the only child they had left after baby Teddy strangled himself on the curtain cords he dragged into his cot when he was supposed to be napping, was 7 back then, and he was mostly a good kid. It had taken him a while to get over Teddy's death, it had taken them all a while, but he'd settled into the life of an only child by the time Eileen insisted that she had nowhere else to go and was coming to stay. Unfortunately, Eileen was in many ways more demanding than a child, but Billy seemed to have coped with the change in his living circumstances well enough. He was independent and smart, and he had a good friend in young Aiden. She lifted her head and looked out over the yellow gold of the wheat fields that abutted their property. Billy and Aiden were probably out there somewhere now, building huts in the wheat stalks and chasing rabbits. They caught a rabbit last week too, a half-grown buck that foolishly blundered into their homemade trap. She'd made the meat into a tasty stew for supper, and Billy had looked so darn proud of himself when she served it up. "Where's Nathan?" Eileen asked suddenly. "Is he at work?" "No, he's not at work. It's Saturday. He's gone over to help Pete Dinger build his new carport." She rolled another row of peas off her palm and into the bowl. The main problem with peas was that no matter how many you thought you had, it was never quite as much as you wanted once you'd husked them all from their shells. Eileen snorted. Nathan always was a people pleaser. "No, he wasn't." "He isn't." "That's an awful thing to say." "Nathan has always had his own mind and he's not afraid to use it. He's helping Pete because that's what good neighbors do." Eileen snorted again, this time sending a small droplet of mucus flying out of her nose to land on her spindly knee. She idly rubbed at it with the tip of one gnarled finger. "You and Perry might have made more friends if you'd helped your neighbors out sometimes," Mandy said archly. She didn't expect a response. Eileen seldom responded when anyone tried to point out her own shortcomings, yet she was the first to speak up when she considered the time was right to list the failings of others. "I'm gonna need you to take me to see the doctor next week," Eileen said after a few minutes of silence. "Why? What's wrong with you now?" This was another one of Eileen's regular habits. If she was feeling picked on in any way, she would drag up a health issue that she claimed needed immediate attention. Mandy was certain she invented half of them, but she never allowed her daughter to come into the doctor's office with her when she went in to see him. Mandy was also certain that Dr. James looked relieved each time he opened the door to allow his elderly patient to leave, but he was practiced at not meeting Mandy's eye. You could say whatever else you liked about Dr. James, but he most definitely abided by the constraints of HIPAA regulations. "My hip is paining me," Eileen said mysteriously. "Again? Once they start failing, they don't stop. Keeps me awake at night." Eileen grimaced and made a groaning noise as she shifted in her chair, playing out one of her minor theatricals for her audience of one. Mandy had often thought that her mother should have been on the stage where she could have acted out her small dramas to her heart's content. And no, she wasn't being unkind in her thinking. She'd known Eileen for her entire life and she was well aware of her mother's cunning, self-centered foibles. "You are getting older, Mother. You have to expect a few aches and pains. Just you wait until you're my age. You'll know all about it then." "I'm sure I will." Mandy rolled out another row of peas. So far, she hadn't managed to cover the bottom of the bowl with the green pearls, yet the pail was nearly a quarter full of empty shells. Eileen changed the subject again, moving on to the less prickly topic of a TV series they had both been following and were happily invested in. As Mandy shelled peas and gently rocked the chair, the women discussed the actors and the storyline. In this manner, the next half an hour passed pleasantly enough. The day was hot and windless, but it was shady up here on the porch away from the cruel heat of the sun. Mandy finally had 1/3 of a bowl of peas to show for her efforts. She plunged her fingers into the silky beads and allowed them to fall through the gaps, idly measuring their light weight. "That's a nice little amount to cook up for dinner. I thought we could have some fried chicken, a few baby potatoes, and some coleslaw to go along with it. I might make some biscuits too." She stood up and glanced over at her mother, only to see that the old lady had fallen back into a doze. She shifted her gaze, looking out over the waving fields of wheat once more. Billy was out there somewhere, out adventuring, but he would be home once he got hungry. She bent to pick up the pail of empty shells and then she stepped back into the cool of the house, ready to start on the rest of the meal preparation. Nelson Galesburg faced the incoming tide and was primed to throw out the line of his trusty breakaway HDX surfcaster when an unexpected sound ripped through the air. He halted the cast mid-swing and cocked his head to listen. A cry for help? Someone in trouble? Or was it a seabird? A gutsy, loud, ring-billed gull? Sometimes their cries seemed to be almost human. He squinted up at the cloudless blue sky, but, at this moment, there wasn't a bird in sight. He listened, waiting to see if the noise would repeat itself, but all he could hear now was the gentle swish and sigh of the waves. The ocean that lay before him was placid and largely unruffled. Larson'S Cove wasn't the kind of place that was popular with swimmers or kayakers, not when there were other, better options so close by. Must have been a bird. He flung out his line and watched as the thin nylon thread that supported the bait and home-crafted lead sinker sailed through the air and splashed into the sea. He didn't usually come down here to fish. Mostly he preferred to go further along the coast to his favorite spot, but his buddy Charlie Montgomery had hooked, played, and landed several good-sized yellowfin croaker and a 20-pound halibut from this exact location on Wednesday evening. He was keen to test his own luck today, although he hadn't told Charlie that he was coming here. Nelson and Charlie had enjoyed numerous robust conversations over the years, intense discussions debating such important subjects as fishing tackle, bait, and the best fishing spots in and around Meadowville. Some of those conversations had been caged in deviousness. A naturally competitive fisherman never wanted to give away too many details that might allow someone else the upper hand, but they'd been mostly honest with each other. Or at least Nelson had been mostly honest, and he liked to think that Charlie had been too. Mostly. Probably about as honest as two weather-hardened, middle-aged fishermen could be, anyway. The weather today was hot, scorching hot. It felt like the sort of weather that might have rolled in to make itself at home, and, just like the guest who stayed a mite too long, everyone was sure to be wishing it gone by the end of the week. The relief of a cooling breeze could be coy in this region during the summer months, often not making its presence known for weeks at a time. Most folks around here brushed the seasonal heat off and said it was something you eventually got used to, but Nelson had lived in Meadowville for his full 52 years now, and he was still waiting for the day when he could say that he was used to it. He gazed out over the placid ocean, studying the water from beneath the brim of his battered fishing hat. The tide was on the rise, and this was always a good time to throw out a line. He had his heart set on hooking one of those halibut, and preferably a heftier one than the fish that Charlie had dragged in. Not that it mattered too much if it didn't weigh more than Charlie's one. As far as Charlie was concerned, Nelson's fish would be at least a pound heavier, and that was regardless of whatever number the scales showed. As the bank manager of one of Meadowville's two banks, Nelson had what he considered to be a healthily ambitious spirit, along with a well-honed willingness to tip the odds in his favor whenever he had the chance. He idly looked down, glancing again at the oily water in a nearby rock pool that he'd noticed earlier. The surface of the water shone beneath the sun rays in lurid colors of pink and green, obscuring the contents of the pool below. His brain still struggled to find an answer for it. It was as if someone had dropped a cup of engine sump oil or cooking oil into the water, but why would anyone want to go and do that? Besides, they would have had to lug the oil across all those mid-sized to large-sized rocks that he had just clambered over to get down here, and that would be a ludicrous thing to do. He shifted his position, looking around the bay. It didn't take him long to detect that every other rock pool in the vicinity had the same oily sheen. Had it been washed in by the tide? Pollution or off-spill from passing boats? Again, he looked out over the softly undulating ocean. There was a fishing trawler all the way out there, the vessel presenting as not much more than a speck on the horizon from this perspective. There weren't too many boats that came in close to the shore in this bay. Instead, they headed down the coastline to Longview Marina and Wharf. The sea end of the wharf in Larson'S Bay had fallen into disrepair several years ago, and there hadn't been anyone with enough desire to want to fix it since then. Apparently, it was no longer safe to moor boats there, but the seafood restaurant near the parking lot end of the wharf was still operational, or it would be again soon. Larson's Shed. A new owner had recently purchased the place and had plans to resurrect it as a going concern. The sale had passed across his desk at the bank, and he'd heard that the restaurant's new owner was an out-of-towner intent on lifting the place back to the lofty heights of its former glory. He wished him the best of luck with his venture, and sometimes dumb luck was all a person needed. Every fisherman knew that. Nelson's thoughts drifted, as they were wont to do whenever he was out fishing. He had proposed to his wife at that very restaurant, although it was a far more opulent establishment back in those days. They didn't go out to restaurants all that much now, preferring to cook the fish that Nelson caught at home. He kept restaurant outings for his business meetings, and they were mostly out-of-town meetings anyway. He had a state-of-the-art barbecue grill and smoker in his yard that got regular workouts, and he was proud of his homegrown recipes. He licked his lips, thinking of the halibut pot pie his wife could make if he managed to hook one of the coveted fish. Halibut pot pie with a teaspoon or two of creamed horseradish and a fluffy mashed potato crust. Or perhaps she could make it into a tasty kedgeree. He did enjoy a good halibut kedgeree, although both those recipes were probably better suited to the cooler weather. The noise came again, that strange, wispy scream that had alerted him earlier. He looked up, watching as a couple of seabirds whirled and circled in the sky above, but the noise hadn't come from up there. He looked around once more, searching for what could have made the sound. The bay was deserted from one end of the cove to the other. There was no question that he was the only one here. Larson's Cove had never been a popular bay at the best of times, not even when the wharf was fully maintained and operational. It lacked the attraction of a sandy shore, and the jagged, uneven rocks that were dotted along the entire curve of the bay put a lot of people off from coming down here. The high cliffs and rough sea that marked the far end of the bay were also a deterrent. There were plenty of other bays in the vicinity that offered far greater appeal and a much nicer all-round experience for day trippers. His gaze resettled on the wharf and on the hulking shape of Larson's Shed. The sun was directly behind the structure, for the moment throwing it into deep shade. Maybe the new cook was over there in the restaurant now, boiling up lobsters while they worked on their upcoming menu. Lobsters often let out an eerie death squeal when they were plunged into boiling water, although Nelson had never heard a lobster squeal that sounded anything like that one. And yes, a sound could carry a long way on this breathless air, but it was highly unlikely that he would be able to hear the tiny shriek of a lobster emanating from Larson's shed so loudly and clearly from here. The tip of his fishing rod suddenly bent down in a deep arc and the tug of the line ricocheted up his arms, jerking him back to the task at hand. He'd hooked something big. He took a tighter grip on the handle and reel, braced his feet against the rocks to prevent himself from overbalancing during the battle that was sure to follow, and then embarked on the exhilarating game of a fierce man versus fish man tug-o-war.